So it seems that already people are moving on from this year's elections and from the shutdown, and Democrats in particular want to move on from the shutdown fiasco. But I think it's really important to pause here and take a moment to look at these things as they show an important through line that I think is really important from our party. So even though, of course, everyone is focused on the Epstein emails right now and any further developments that we have in this case, which I'm happy to also talk about, taking this moment to reflect and to look at what's going on with the Democratic Party, I think is a really important thing to learn from. Because the fact of the matter is that the party needs to reform, and there's a lot of different parts of that, but the major thing that I'll be focused on in today's episode is feckless establishment Democrats. These Democrats who still believe in the old way of doing politics and basically repeat this drivel, this bipartisan like fakeness, this consultant driven sort of way of talking that is not how normal people talk. And this is something that has a history in our party and is something that is driving away important members of our base. And that's what I want to zero in on, and as well as lessons that we can take from this year's elections in terms of charting a better path forward. So with that being said, this is Left and Loose. Welcome to the show after a brief hiatus due to travels and being sick. This is the mostly weekly show where normally I call out Republican bullshit. This week I'll be doing more liberal soul searching / self-therapy. I'm your host, Rich Kim. And before I get into today's episode, I just want to cover two main points. First, as I mentioned, Epstein emails and files are in the news, as well as the fallout from that. I'm following this really crazy saga and the developments there. Of course, this is just such a horrible story in general. I'm happy to cover this in the next episode, as well as how I think Democrats should talk about this in the context of Trump and just the Republican Party in general. But let me know if you guys think that's something that you really want or not. And speaking of which, appreciate your guys' support, whether it's on YouTube, podcasts, Substack, or on social media. On Instagram in particular, we're almost at 3.5K followers, and we just hit 800K views. That's in, let's say, 2 months so far, or less than 2 months. So really happy about the direction that the show is going and the channel is going. But of course, it's still early stages and really figuring out the direction here. So appreciate you guys bearing with me. And by all means, if you have feedback, please do send that over. If I can deal with roughly 1,000 MAGA people calling me a libtard and worse on Instagram, I can handle a little bit of constructive criticism. And of course, there's so much support that comes in, including on social media. So really appreciate that. Okay, now on to the episode. So I've had this kind of episode in the back of my mind for a while now, but I did not want to bring this up while it looks like Democrats were putting up a fight during the shutdown. And especially during the elections when we had won this year, I did not want to be the downer on that. But then, of course, as soon as Democrats caved on the shutdown, that just reminded me, as well as a lot of people, of the critique that we have of the Democratic Party and why the Democratic Party has been hemorrhaging voters for years now. Because the truth is that the way that Democrats played the shutdown did not ultimately come as a shock. That the Democratic Party has a history of demoralizing and alienating its base. And it goes back basically to the most recent major figures in our party, whether it was Obama or Hillary or Biden, Harris, etc. So in this episode, I would like to also cover that sort of recent history as well, and that as a way to describe these establishment politics. Basically, being out of touch with our base, not talking in a way that real people talk, and then when we do have power, putting in incremental policies that don't live up to the rhetoric that we do have. Okay, so the structure of this episode, just to summarize, is first going to be talking about the shutdown and why I think that represents major problems in the Democratic Party. Second is going after then these sort of major recent political figures in our party and where these problems have come from. And third is talking about the elections and a path forward. And that I'll cover just then very quickly. So first on the shutdown. So everyone knows that the shutdown was about healthcare. During the Biden pandemic years, Democrats had passed the American Rescue Plan and the Inflation Reduction Act, both of which put in place subsidies to make Obamacare cheaper and more widely available for people. It was a way to make healthcare in America more affordable and to get more people covered, which makes sense during the pandemic, but was ultimately intended to apply just going forward in general. And Democrats at the time had been dealing also with this sort of feckless establishment part of the party. And I'm using the word feckless just to describe people who are like spineless or just like lacking the character and conviction of what we really need for bold democratic leadership. And the people at this time that we were dealing with were, of course, Joe Manchin of West Virginia, a senator, and former Senator Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona. So they had said at the time, okay, they were concerned about spending and needing to put time limits on how long these subsidies applied. So the compromise at the time was that the subsidies would only last until the end of this year. And Democrats made the classic mistake of assuming that this policy, which was just an incremental thing then at the time, would be so popular that, of course, it would naturally just be extended by whatever government then was existing today. Of course, then Trump and Republicans came in and they hate anything that Democrats have anything to do with. So Democrats then decided this year that we were going to shut down the government because we had walked away from a fight around a shutdown earlier this year, but we're going to shut down in order to make this one issue central, that we needed a deal with Republicans to extend these Obamacare subsidies. Makes sense politically too, right? Costs are skyrocketing for people, whether we see that in people's daily lives at the grocery store or their housing or otherwise. So when it comes to people's healthcare premiums, it's a really important thing to try to keep these low. And the government then shuts down as a result. And you would think that in a normal world, this should be an easy thing to resolve, right? These subsidies end up being super popular, that ultimately Obamacare has over 20 million people that are covered by it, the vast majority of which are benefiting and can afford healthcare because of these subsidies. And actually, the majority of these people who are using these subsidies are in red states at the end of the day. So Republicans have an interest too in reaching some sort of deal, right? Of course, that's not the Republican Party that we're dealing with, though. Their response to that is to do two things. To say, one, they're not going to deal with Democrats and make a deal when Democrats are taking the government hostage, quote unquote. And second, that, Democrats want to give health care to illegal immigrants. Now, both of these things are just demonstrably false, right? In the first case, it's like, well, Trump, the party leader, is supposed to be Mr. Art of the deal, the best negotiator ever. And then suddenly there's not some deal that can be worked out during a shutdown over this pretty straightforward issue. And then second, you don't have to look very far to see that these are for Americans. These are people literally in these Republicans' districts who need these subsidies in order to afford health care. So of course, this is just help to keep people's healthcare costs low for Americans. So Republicans refuse to strike a deal. We then know what happens, right? The shutdown is very painful for the 40 some odd days that it's lasted. Federal workers are not getting paid. Air traffic controllers are calling out, and there's lines at airports. People are not getting SNAP benefits, which is a horrible thing considering that there's 40 million people on SNAP benefits or so. A lot of children, millions of children are covered under SNAP benefits. It was a painful thing, but we know how ultimately this ended. A group of 8 senators decided to strike a deal with Republicans. This was all organized by Chuck Schumer, even though he says that he has nothing to do with it. But it turns out that all of these 8 senators are not up for re-election in 2026. So basically, they're unlikely to face any accountability for striking this deal in the near term, and they're like the perfect scapegoats for the entire base being pissed off at them as a result. And even if Chuck Schumer was not involved in this, it just shows just what an ineffective minority leader that he was to not be able to keep the Democratic senators together. But the likeliest result is that he did in fact bless him. And this has real consequences, right? We're now seeing that people, as we speak, are having their premiums on average doubled, if not more. And people like Bernie Sanders have said that as a result, people are going to lose coverage, and this could lead to the death of 50,000 Americans per year. Because in all likelihood, Republicans who have just promised to put a vote on these ACA subsidies without striking a deal with Democrats are more than likely to just not approve this. And Mike Johnson in the House, for example, the Speaker of the House, he said that he just will not even hold a vote on this. So that's a shutdown. Basically, the Democrats did shut down the government for a good reason, but ended up getting nothing from it because Republicans would not negotiate, and then a group of senators caved. So to my analysis of this, just to be clear, I can understand the politics of these establishment Democrats who did cave. They were looking at a lot of pain that was already happening and a lot more real pain that was going to set in. They were seeing that Republicans did not want to negotiate, so we were in for a very long shutdown, and they wanted to basically cut their losses and to avoid the risk that basically as the shutdown goes on, that there would be blowback on Democrats. And furthermore, there's this argument that Democrats are also somehow playing some kind of 4D chess. That the plan was that they were going to then cave on these, reopen the government, vote to discharge the Epstein files, release these Epstein emails that we're now seeing, and everybody would be able to see that. And then when Republicans hold this vote on the ACA subsidies that's likely to fail, then it's all on them. And Democrats can say, well, we fought for it, we brought attention to this issue. And oh, by the way, if we had succeeded, this would be a gift for Republicans because it's helping to keep people's costs low, and maybe it's too late to even extend these subsidies, and maybe it would only be for a year if we even got a deal, blah, blah, blah. It goes on and on and on. But this is the essential problem in my mind. It's this too clever by half. It's the too cute by half way of approaching politics, where it's like, okay, we're going to say we care about this issue for a certain amount of time, rally our base for it as long as it's useful for us, and then as soon as it's not politically useful for us, we're going to throw it out the window and screw over basically this thing that people really do care about, and just do whatever we can do to try to get some political advantage here. And all that talk about these values that we have and the fact that we're going to fight Trump no matter what, it just goes out the window as soon as Democrats don't feel like it's necessary anymore. And I realize that I'm overgeneralizing here. This was just a vein in our party, but I think that's the issue. It's this establishment portion of the party who wants to look bipartisan and look like they are practicing good politics without actually delivering things for the base that people really care about. And it's just so alienating and demoralizing for us when you put us through this of really focusing in on this issue and also shutting down the government. And also, by the way, more people rallying behind you in this year's elections and wanting you to put up a fight because Democrats did exceedingly well, and then to just suddenly fold as soon as there was this then political calculus. As you can see, it's a very demoralizing sentiment for the party. Basically, you're screwing over your base in the process, and it's no wonder then that after consistently doing this over the years, that the Democratic Party has been hemorrhaging voters, and the Democratic brand is at such low levels because Democrats are not willing to live up to this rhetoric that they're putting out there. And that's really then leading to my second point of the recent history that we have. And I'll just start then with Barack Obama, who of course is an amazing figure in so many ways, but just to be very pragmatic about what his presidency was at the end of the day. He came in 2008 promising change, promising hope that the country would change for the better under his presidencies. And ultimately, there was good things that he delivered, including Obamacare, even though that did represent at the time basically a Frankenstein of establishment compromises. But Obama did sort of remake the party in his image and did have this very aspirational rhetoric that he brought to the party and that still exists in the party today, for better or for worse. But just looking at it honestly, other than Obamacare, for example, which has some caveats, a lot of it didn't live up to this rhetoric, right? Like, he led us through the financial crisis, but ultimately a lot of people really suffered during the Great Recession, and zero bankers or zero executives were held meaningfully responsible for what they did to the American people. And oh, by the way, during this time too, illegal immigration was started. There was cracks in the system. It was starting to get bad and lead to the situations that we're basically seeing in more recent years. And whereas Obama did do things like this executive order for Dreamers, which is great, there was not sort of any meaningful improvement to the immigration system or to border security at the time. That later have become really big issues. And these sort of things did become then issues in Hillary Clinton's campaign in 2016, right? Trump ran, and the things that he focused on were make America great again, that people were not doing as well in their economic lives, and build the wall, that there was a lot of this immigration, illegal immigration that was getting out of hand. And of course, Trump put a lot of xenophobia in it, where Mexico is sending the rapists, et cetera, et cetera. Hillary Clinton's response to that, of course, was to not meaningfully address these issues and to instead focus on the character of Donald Trump and to call a lot of these people who actually cared about these issues and were supporting him deplorables. And we know how this ultimately went. The people who did care about these issues and were willing to look past his character flaws voted him into office. And this was Hillary Clinton's establishment approach at the time, right? To ignore what people were saying and to instead put forward this rhetoric, which was not really meaningfully addressing these issues that mattered to people, and then seeming very out of touch as a result. So Biden runs in 2020 then, and he promises to build back better during and after the pandemic to lead us through that. Now, to be fair, Biden had passed quite a lot. That did actually a lot of legislation. But my view there is when Democrats actually were in power, that either it was too much or it was too little. Like too much in the sense of money that was given out during the pandemic to people who didn't need it, and it was actually abused in a lot of instances by a lot of businesses, for example. And then otherwise, it was a lot of incrementalism, that it was things like rural Wi-Fi or electric charging stations, or it was student loan forgiveness, or it was manufacturing and renewable energy tax incentives. It was these things that are good policy sense and were implemented to a certain extent, some more than others, but ultimately did not meaningfully impact people's lives, or people didn't see it in their everyday lives. And even things like, keeping prescription drug prices lower, it did help certainly a number of Americans, but not in just like a very visible way that most Americans felt for a lot of these policies. So again, there's this example of this very high-minded rhetoric that the policies are really not living up to. And furthermore, during the Biden administration, inflation, of course, is getting out of control post-pandemic. Now, you can argue a president doesn't really have a lot of control over inflation, but Joe Biden could have certainly made this more of an issue than it actually was. Instead, his approach was to say, inflation's not an issue, it's transitory, and we actually have the best numbers in comparison to other countries. And it was just so tone deaf at the time. So again, an example of being just very out of touch and not really in tune to something that the base is actually, that a lot of American people are really feeling. So again, there's this common through line through all of these figures that ultimately is leading to Democrats becoming less popular and Republicans becoming more popular, because there's this pattern of just not listening to these issues that people really care about, and instead having this rhetoric that doesn't really connect. And then even when you're in power, only these like incremental policies that are just sort of off the mark. And that's then leading to this year's elections. The third point that we have here is these elections did chart a path forward, but I also am very concerned about Democrats like over learning the lesson, or the establishment part of the party then basically exploiting / taking this the wrong way. That the main focus and the main reason why Democrats won was affordability. That right now in Trump 2.0, costs are exploding due to these tariffs, due to the big beautiful bill or otherwise. And the main result is that people are seeing that in their everyday lives, whether it comes to Walmart, Target shopping, on Amazon, whether it's their housing costs, you name it, basically. Everywhere, restaurants, everywhere that people are going, people are seeing this. So it did make sense then that the candidates who did really well in this year's elections focused on affordability, on pointing out what the problem was, and then saying what they wanted to then do in office to help people. And that was a winning message. The problem that I see is Democrats then just repeating this line of affordability, that's basically going to be something that becomes like a mantra without a lot of substance behind it. So, for example, in 2026, in next year's elections, realistically, a lot of what we can just do there is just to say, hey, we're going to put put a stop to or try to limit these radical right economic policies from the government that are hurting the American people. But especially as we look to 2028, we need to have just this bold version of economic populism. And just to spitball here, I would say that would include tax the rich, millions of houses for Americans, cracking down on corporate price gouging, healthcare, childcare, basically these things that would result in people seeing thousands of dollars in their pockets every year, and it has a very visible impact on people, and it's very meaningful to people because of how this cost situation really has gotten out of control over these many years. The concern is that if we're still dealing with the sort of feckless establishment Democrat wing of the party, it's these people who are going to be like, oh well, we're concerned about the spending, or they don't want to tax the corporate donors, and so the concern is that we're not going to be able to actually have this broad vision of economic populism that we're actually going to fight for and are actually going to make a difference for people in their everyday lives. And as a result, we're just going to end up coming in with this momentum and then losing it as soon as we possibly can in a post-Trump era. And we're just setting ourselves up for failure at this point. So this is why, and just to finish, I think that this feckless establishment part of the party is so dangerous because it is subverting our long-term interests. Yes, you could argue that there's some sort of short-term political wins, if you could call it that, or some political cleverness that the establishment does achieve if you just look at the shutdown. But over a long-term basis, the fact that we're destroying our brand, we're destroying our support with our base, and we're actually destroying our credibility with working class people is ultimately the issue. And that's why I think that we need to shift this party for a more bolder and more progressive version that's ultimately going to deliver. And this does not have to even be radical at the end of the day. How radical is it to be like, hey, we really need to fix a lot of these systems that are just not working for people, whether it's healthcare, whether it's childcare, whether it's immigration, a lot of these issues that Republicans keep raising to, whether it's crime, whether it's the economy, first and foremost, that a lot of these things are not radical when you talk about trying to address issues that matter to people and affect people's everyday lives. So that's my view. As mentioned, I'm happy to do an episode on, for example, this whole Epstein thing, and that'll probably be the next one that I'll try to put together in short order. And so I'll see you guys for that one. Or, if something else comes up in the meantime. Well, cheers.